morning. My name is Judd Devermont, and I am the director of the Africa program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to the third event in our Africa Debate Series. This event was made possible through the generous support of the Open Society Foundations. Let me tell you a little bit about what we're doing today. Since the end of the Cold War, and certainly since the late 90s, there's been a great deal of consistency in US policy towards sub-Saharan Africa. Yes, there's been new initiatives and tweaks on the margins, but arguably there's a clear and consistent through line during the past 2 decades. It's my view that it's important to challenge these conventions. We need to think about these approaches and question whether or not they are still working. It's particularly important because we're entering a period of prolonged strategic drift, fractured governance, and uncertainty. We're feeling it every day as we stay at home and do our best to practice social distancing. As the COVID-19 pandemic is demonstrating, there are really big questions about the US willingness and capacity to solve problems at home and abroad. So it's within this framing that we decided to launch our debate series. In November, we had a vigorous debate: does the US need a foreign policy towards Africa? In February, we traveled to St. Louis to ask the question, does democracy foster economic growth? And today, virtually, we want to tackle a new question, which is, do human rights protections advance counterterrorism objectives? And this is not just an academic discussion. There are opposing views on the topic, and the outcome of this debate does shape US policy. There are some that think that human rights are essential to preventing and countering violent extremism. There are others that believe human rights are important, but they see tough trade-offs between these values and CT imperatives, counterterrorism imperatives. And there are some that disagree that an emphasis on human rights is central to security assistance. So today couldn't be more relevant. This is a live issue in policy circles, and we can see its importance as it plays out during the COVID-19 pandemic. Several of the region's security forces have been accused of significant human rights abuses while enforcing lockdown measures, and that has led to some deaths. So I am grateful to have 4 very impressive individuals here today to argue both sides. Let me be clear, and I'll say this a bunch of times throughout today's event, this is an intellectual exercise. It's a Team A, Team B structured analytic tool. Our goal is not to bash the United States or even to repudiate past approaches, but through this debate, develop a new consensus and innovate a new approach to Africa. Let me stress, our debaters have been asked to play a part. They're not necessarily presenting their own personal views, but rather they're arguing maximalist positions to provoke thought and elicit new insights. After the 4 debaters present their assigned positions, we'll transition to a panel discussion. This is an opportunity for them to share their true position on the relationship between human rights and security assistance. Now, my favorite part of this event is that you, the audience, have an opportunity to vote on some of the main points presented in the debate and throw some tough questions at our panelists. To do this in a virtual setting is actually just as easy as doing it live and in person. All you have to do is visit the event page at css.org and scroll down to the bottom to vote on different points our panelists will present. You can also click on the link on that page to submit questions. Okay, without further ado, let me introduce our debaters. Arguing that human rights protections do advance counterterrorism objectives is Adote Akwe. He is the Deputy Director for Advocacy and Government Relations for Amnesty International USA. Previously, Adote served as the Senior Policy Advisor for CARE USA and the Africa Director for the Lawyers Committee for Human Rights, now known as Human Rights First. Adote also served as a Research and Human Rights Director for the American Committee on Africa and the Africa Fund. Joining Adote on the pro side is Nanihal Singh. He is an assistant professor at the Naval War College, the author of Seizing Power, The Strategic Logic of Military Coups. It's a book based on the dynamics and outcomes of military coups, based on 300 hours of interviews and a statistical analysis of 471 coup attempts. It's also one of my favorite books on the security sector in Africa, so I recommend it highly. Arguing on the human rights protections does not advance counterterrorism objectives are retired Colonel Chris Wyatt. He is the CEO of the Indaba Africa Group. He previously served as the Director of African Studies at the U.S. Army War College. Chris has been posted at several senior positions across the continent, including Senior Military Advisor at the U.S. Mission to the African Union, Chief of the Office of Security Cooperation in Uganda, Mauritania, Niger, Botswana, and Liberia. He also served as the Senior Africa Foreign Areas Officer at the U.S. Africa Command in Germany and held analytic positions at the Defense Intelligence Agency in Washington, D.C. And finally, joining Chris is Karen Allen. She is a Senior Research Advisor at the Institute for Security Studies, ISS, in South Africa. She recently published 2 highly relevant articles to today's debate, Kenya's Counterterrorism Trade-off, and why is the US ramping up its anti-terrorism efforts in Kenya? For the past 15 years, Karen was a senior BBC foreign correspondent based first in Nairobi and then Johannesburg. She is also a visiting fellow at the King's College London in the Department of Army Studies. We have a great event for you today, incredible speakers with great expertise. So why don't we jump right into it? Adote, let me turn to you to present your opening statement.
Thank you very much, Judd. I think obviously I come to this with a little bit of a bias because I come from a human rights community, but the global community agreed that human rights violations and human rights standards were essential. And that was the result of the Second World War and all of the abuses that happened during that period. And they established standards for governments and security forces to comply with, whether they were in conflict situations or whether they weren't. And human rights, the concepts and the obligations of governments and their security forces to comply with were underscored by the ratifications of these international and regional instruments. Basically, people need to be and want to be treated with dignity, and they want to have their militaries and their police respect that dignity. What does counterterrorism efforts do? It basically is a response to violent acts from armed groups that are targeting indiscriminately and that are meant to destabilize the rule of law towards a political objective, one would hope. But in many cases, the response by governments has been as brutal and probably as destructive as some of the actions of some of these groups. In particular, there are 3 areas that I think need to be discussed. One, of course, is the erosion of the rule of law through repressive legislation. Governments in Africa have an unfortunate record of sweeping legislation that has ill-defined concepts of what terrorism constitutes, and also what kinds of obligations they have to be transparent and to hold their forces accountable. Counterterrorism initiatives have reinforced that. You have repressive legislation in Cameroon, in Nigeria, in Kenya, Ethiopia. Most of these countries and their governments adopted, following the 9/11 attacks, the policy of introducing new emergency type powers that were meant to help them deal with the risk of terrorist attacks. Unfortunately, that has led to crushing of civil society organizations. It's meant harassment of independent media. It has meant criminalization of even questioning the activities of governments and the security force apparatus. That cannot help because without transparency, we do not know whether CT efforts are actually succeeding or whether they aren't. And I think, Judd, you mentioned it earlier, that in this period of COVID-19, where information could literally mean the difference between life and death, those restrictions are going to come back and haunt us in a major way. The second area of real concern has been the abuses by these security forces. The Nigerian and Cameroonian security forces are just 2 prime examples of people or of units that have been videotaped or have videotaped themselves committing abuses with impunity. Nigeria has had over 25 different commissions of inquiry to look into abuses by the security forces. None of those have resulted in any action whatsoever. So you have security forces that are committing abuses against their own people, justifying it as counterterrorism, and arguably undermining their own ability or their own campaigns to defeat these terrorist organizations. The third area, I think, is one which, of course, comes back to the activities of their partner countries. And here, I think I'm talking again about the perceptions. Are the counterterrorism initiatives actually seen to be in the benefit of the populations and the countries that they are meant for? Or are they raising questions and concerns about whether the government is no better than the terrorist groups? And here, I think the prime example would be the situation in Somaliland and Somalia, where the civilian casualties as a result of airstrikes by the United States as well as its partners have really resulted in not only loss of life, but also the lack of accountability has also created a sense that, our lives don't matter. And it's made worse by the fact that it took until 2020 for the Department of Defense to actually acknowledge that they had mistakenly killed civilians and that they were now going to try to improve their reporting. I'll just wrap up by saying that if the objective is to defeat to defeat terrorism, then it probably behooves all of us to look at what's happened in other theaters and where security-focused and oriented initiatives have had questionable results, and whether the other aspect of counterterrorism efforts, such as building judicial capacity, building social services, in other words, providing a viable alternative to the population, is actually as important and as resourced as the military side of it, might we not have had better results? That's why human rights, of course, is important irrespective of what area or situation it takes place in. But it's about time that we actually started to rethink what we do with counterterrorism and placing human rights at the center of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Adote. Chris Wyatt for the rebuttal.
Well, thank you, Judd. I hate to start the rebuttal with an agreement, but I'll have to agree with Adote from the outset. Indeed, at the end of the Second World War, because of the abuses that took place, the world did come together with the creation of the United Nations. And in fact, in the United Nations Charter, Chapter 9, Article 55 specifically says that the United Nations shall promote universal respect and observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms. So we're in agreement on that. The issue is that these are not absolute. States have an obligation and an opportunity for derogation, given reasonable limits and proportionality when it comes to the implementation of acts that involve counterterrorism, things of that nature. So the question here is not a question of whether it's human rights and whether states observe or not. It's a question of how it's monitored, how it's controlled, who's responsible for paying attention to it, and who prosecutes violations of this. So one discussion that comes up frequently, particularly when it comes to partners, for instance, the United States partnering with countries in Africa, is the question of human rights training and human rights vetting. So for instance, we have public law here in the United States, Leahy law, among others, that requires that the Department of Defense and Department of State look into the background of our security partners when we do training in Africa and around the world. Now, this is a system that's been in place for well over a decade, and it's had its positives and it's had its detractions to it. But it is a system that does take a look at what our partners are doing. The question when it comes to evaluating our partners for security and cooperating with them when it comes to human rights abuses and counterterrorism or defense and security cooperation in general is a question of efficacy and ownership by the partner. We can identify a partner and say a partner, for instance, in this case, Adote mentioned Nigeria with these 23 commissions in which the security forces have been accused of human rights abuses. We can look at that and we make a subjective determination. The question is, do we make the right subjective determination and what's the basis for that? So the question comes down to when we're working with partners, for instance, we have a requirement to provide training in human rights and international law to our partners for security. And the question of the training is a question of efficacy and ownership. Is the training effective and does it get the results that we desire? Now, one of the challenges I found frequently as an operator, someone in practice of this, a practitioner of this, is that oftentimes we have partners that we provide training to avoid human rights abuses, to follow international law, international agreements, international obligations that countries are part of. But what happens is the partner must own this. They have to take responsibility for this and be willing to commit to it. And one of the blind spots that I've seen with Western liberalism, now not to confuse liberalism in the US political sense of liberal and conservative, but rather traditional international political theory of liberalism, the thought in international organizations and freedoms and basic human rights, things like that. One of the challenges and blind spots, in my view, with Western liberalism is that oftentimes most folks who get engaged in this think that taking measures is the end of the story. And simply training a partner or providing assistance to a partner and admonishing them about proper ways to do things does not guarantee that they'll follow the rule of law, that they will protect people's basic human rights. And this is one of the challenges we have. You cannot approach this in a check the block fashion. If you're simply checking the block, you're not accomplishing human rights, you're not protecting people's basic freedoms and liberties. Now, as far as a state and the responsibility of state and states' challenges, as I mentioned earlier on, we have degradation, and that means that states are allowed to make exceptions when it comes to serious security crisis. And terrorism is one of these things that comes up. We must not forget that while we admonish the state and we pay attention to the state because the state is all powerful in many respects, that at the same time, those committing the terrorism are violating human rights because security of the individual and freedom and protection of oneself is a basic human right that must be addressed and something that must be protected. So the key distinction, I think, here to talk on this issue is that we do have an obligation for states to behave themselves, and there are mechanisms in place. But we also must remember that many of these mechanisms are voluntarily entered into by states. And we still live, even in the 21st century, in a Westphalian system of states in which states have sovereignty. Now, what is the challenge if a state violates its actions or doesn't live up to its ideals? Well, in the international system, a realist will tell you that there isn't really much that can be done. States can't do much against others. We know in practice, of course, that's not true. The larger states, the more powerful states, do have the ability and mechanisms to punish other states for violating these basic human rights. But the actual implementation or intervention to stop people from violating human rights is something that we've often found ourselves lacking for. I think the perfect example of this is the case of Rwanda in 1994. The international community sat by helplessly and did very little to intervene as close to 850,000 people were murdered. Did very little. We had obligations under international agreements. The state of Rwanda had obligations, and the world accomplished very little. So we can train folks all day long. We can discuss the issue of basic human rights, and we can talk about interventions for counterterrorism and insurgencies. But the reality is, what is the mechanism to ensure that states are adhering to this and behave themselves when it comes to human rights? And so that's really, I think, the crux of the issue. It's not a question of whether human rights should be respected. It's a question of, is it possible? How is it done? Who do you hold accountable, and how do you hold them accountable? I think the point that Adute made about Nigeria and 23 commissions and no action is very telling. So wonderful. We have looked at human rights abuses in Nigeria and what has come out of it. That's a question of governance. It's up to the state internally to address this, or it's up to the international community to punish Nigeria for it. Now, where do we go with this? Nigeria is a sovereign state, and we'll make an argument that these are internal matters. Other folks will say in the Western liberal tradition that these are human rights, they're basic human rights, and that the international community has an obligation here. And I think therein lies the challenge for all of us when we talk about this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. For those of you at home, I encourage you again to go to our event page where you can vote on some of the points that Adute and Chris just made, but you can also submit questions for the moderated Q&A. We're going to stay on the rebuttal, and we're going to turn to Karen to add some additional amplifying points to what Chris said.
What are the US counter-terrorism objections? The President of the US has said these are to aggressively pursue terrorists, dismantle their networks, and maintain pressure on them to stop re-emerging. So human rights protections mustn't be confused with counter-terrorism imperatives. That's not to diminish the importance of human rights, but they are relative, they're nuanced, and they're shaped by evolving norms. Norms which assume that other rights, such as the right to life, are given. But as we know, in conflict settings, such as, say, Kenya or Somalia, our adversaries are not adhering to those norms. That right to life is not a given. Al-Shabaab has killed more than 34,000 innocent civilians in the past decade. Boko Haram in West Africa, 23,000. The terrorist actors that the US is seeking to neutralize do not obey the laws of war, and they're underpinned by human rights protections. Therefore, when we ask the question, do human rights protections advance counterterrorism objectives, we need to ask, whose human rights? We need to assign perhaps a hierarchy for those rights and figure out, what are we seeking to protect? The right to life is the most fundamental, without which we can't even begin a conversation about other human rights. And so protecting life and dismantling terrorist networks should continue to be the primary focus of counterterrorism objections. Remember, we didn't go into Afghanistan to ensure that girls go to school. It's nice to have, and once security is established, one's able to progress on that and furthering rights. But that was not the initial objective. Likewise, across Africa, our counterterrorism objectives should be about dismantling fighting groups or threat actors, such as that they don't pose a threat to our interests or to our very existence. And when we're talking about human rights, we need to avoid ambiguity and perceptions of weakness. If we blur the lines between human rights and fighting terrorism, we introduce ambiguity. And we're in the danger of projecting a posture of weakness to an enemy that has no compunction about infringing human rights. Therefore, in advancing the US's counterterrorism goals, the objective must be clear. Again, to provide security and not to impose our ideals of human rights norms onto other sovereign states, as Chris has just said. We don't want to play into the hands of our adversaries that accuse us of cultural imperialism by imposing our values on them. It's an issue of timeliness as well. Counterterrorism operations require our troops and those of our allies to be agile, nimble and responsive, to be able to react swiftly and in a timely manner to a terrorist threat. In an environment encumbered by complex human rights considerations, this agility is impeded. We need our counterterrorism personnel to feel confident that we, the citizens back at home, have their backs. That's why we've got, for example, status of forces agreements to give them legal cover to focus on doing the job in hand, knowing that once that job is done, we have smart development and post-conflict reconstruction specialists who can build on developing a human rights-based society. But I repeat, let's not conflate the task. Fighting terrorists and building human rights-based societies are very different tasks. There's also the changing nature of the threat. We need latitude to be able to react. Given the new reality of the hybrid wars that are being fought in this part of the world, where speed is being weaponized and the adversary is adapting much quicker than our forces in many ways, are we able to move forward without the constraints? In West Africa and the Sahel, alliances are being forged, for instance, between militant groups allied with IS and with Al-Qaeda. It's an incredibly potent mix. Given the changing nature of the threat, we need to be able to keep up. New technologies are also being acquired. For example, the weaponized use of drones, which enable armed actors to embed themselves in civilian settings, in hospitals and schools, which have protections under international humanitarian law, whilst continuing to conduct terrorist acts. We need to be able to adapt now and have the freedom to deploy what we consider our most effective tools to get the job done. Finally, respecting the will of the people. In settings such as Kenya, when you look at opinion polls, the research at critical times, including, for example, ahead of elections, has shown consistently that security is the #1 priority for citizens. Adversaries such as Al-Shabaab present the biggest threat to that. People may balk at some of the atrocities that are committed by their own security forces against their own people, such as the Kenyan police. But frankly, when the chips are down, they don't want to live in daily fear of terrorist attacks. Furthermore, economies suffer in the aftermath of a terrorist attack. Unfortunately, they do not meet the same fate with insidious human rights abuses. Remember, people still go on holiday to Egypt, they still go on holiday to Myanmar, despite human rights deficits there. So if we're going to be agile in responding to that threat, the US military will need to demonstrate, again, one clear purpose, that we're able to respond in a timely manner, hit hard, and leave sovereign states to decide what their priorities as a country should be. Therefore, in conclusion, there's a danger of conflating human rights with counterterrorism objectives. That's not to undermine the essential value of human rights, but they have different goals, different levels of nuance, and operate alongside very different timelines. Do human rights advance counterterrorism objectives? I think it's human nature to hope that they do, but I reject this proposition.
Karen, thank you so much. Nani Hall, you're going to round out our debate. Take us back to the affirmative side.
All right. Just to start, a disclaimer. These opinions are my own and not those of my employer. I think we all four of us agree that human rights protections I think all four of us agree on the importance of human rights values. Where we disagree is about the practicality and priority of valuing human rights while fighting terrorist movements. I want to argue very strongly that human rights protections advance counterterrorism objectives, and in particular, that human rights are central to effective counterterrorism. Effective counterterrorism strategies are fundamentally strategies of state building and of governance. To fight terrorist groups, the state needs to act in the following three areas. The state needs to build its capacity, including but not limited to coercive capacity in the security sector. It also needs to deny and deprive other claimants to state authority. And lastly, the state needs to cultivate a healthy and cooperative relationship with society. Because of the history of colonialism, African states have started out with a deficit in all three of these areas. For example, colonial security forces were designed mainly to control populations, not to actually protect them. And it's this history and legacy that leaves African countries vulnerable to terrorist threats. It also makes it very easy for outside actors, including the US, to say, look, these human rights protections cannot be a priority. First, we need to rebuild the state. We need to create security. And then afterwards, as Karen was arguing, the state can choose its values and it can develop human rights in a secondary phase. And at some point, some argue that human rights are actually a luxury, which you can only afford once you've attained basic security. But here's the problem. The problem is that, in fact, human rights are intrinsic to effective counterterrorism. And the way forward is not to ignore human rights, but to filter human rights protections into each aspect of state action. A state that centers human rights can deny terrorist groups access to local recruits and finances. In fact, as Yaki Cilliers said recently on a CSIS Into Africa podcast, one of the most important reasons why citizens join terrorist movements in Africa is because they're on the receiving end of state violence. That is to say, when the state acts in a harsh and indiscriminate fashion, the response of the citizens is not to say, oh yes, we understand the state is trying to protect our security here. It's instead to reject the state's claims to legitimacy and authority, and it makes citizens much more likely to work with terrorist groups, and in the extreme, to join terrorist groups, if not to give money or to look the other way when terrorists are acting. And so this puts a lie to the claim that we need to put forceful action first, and then we can come to human rights. In fact, these two issues are intertwined. Most importantly, when citizens trust the state can obtain the information and intelligence necessary to identify terrorist plots at an early stage and to prevent terrorist violence. Without that intelligence, you're in trouble. There's Mao's famous dictum that insurgent groups must operate like fish in the sea. And it's very hard to drain the entire sea. If you drain the entire sea, what happens is you literally produce more fish, if you follow the metaphor. And so what you want instead is to win over the trust of the people. And when states are able to do this effectively, the state can get the information intelligence they need to act effectively against the terrorist groups, and terrorist groups are then starved of resources. This is not just something that we know from Africa. It's something we know, for example, from Europe. One of the reasons why the IRA became less and less effective over time was because they alienated the populations which they claimed to be protecting. We also know that the experience of state violence produces terrorists from studies of Italy and Germany during the 1960s and 70s. So these are universally observed truths here. Now, one final point. We were discussing whether or not these human rights should be left to the national government. And there is an argument that says, look, The US government can come in there and include human rights training, but at the end of the day, you have to respect sovereignty, and you have to understand that countries are going to value human rights however much they want to. But I think we miss a very important point here, which is that the United States has a long history of backing brutal and oppressive regimes and claiming that this relationship is justified by necessity, by the need to fight communism or to fight terrorism. And recognizing that fighting terrorism requires respecting human rights is necessary not only to inhibit host nations from abusing the human rights of their citizens, but it's also necessary for binding the American government to its stated values. These commitments that we make and the laws that we pass in part because we've realized that unless we prioritize these values, we end up creating outcomes which are against what the United States government wants. And so we want to center human rights in counterterrorism, both because it's effective in the countries where the terrorists are operating, but also because it binds the US government and other allied governments to something which is not only good in terms of values, but good in terms of our own self-interest.
Thank you, Nani Hall. We are going to enter a moderated Q&A from me, and then we'll bring in audience questions. This is your last chance to vote before we reveal the results. So please go to the event page and put in your final votes. You'll have the points made by all of our 4 panelists. As I said at the outset, I assigned roles to our 4 speakers. They may not necessarily have been representing their personal views. So I want to make sure before we get into additional questions that I give a chance for people to reveal if there's any difference between what they said in the debate versus how they view this issue. And it's probably appropriate to go to Chris and Karen first. So Chris and Karen.
Well, Judd, my personal view on this, it's a mix of the two. You know, the issue here is I fundamentally believe in human rights, but it's a question of definition. You know, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights mentions some rights in there that I'm not always fully in agreement with, that they're human rights, that they're actually restrictions or freedoms that people have, not necessarily human rights. But nonetheless, I find myself on both sides of the aisle when it comes to this from a personal standpoint. Specifically, I do believe it's an obligation on the part of the United States to do our best to not create a problem. But the challenge for us, again, the thing about hubris, I strongly do believe that we oftentimes have hubris in that we think we can affect change. And I'll tell a very short story to illustrate this. I was in Uganda as the security cooperation chief at the U.S. Embassy in December of 2013 when the legislature passed an anti-homosexuality law. That law was passed. President Museveni promised Ambassador Delisi he would never sign it, and then he signed it. And then the diplomatic relation between the United States and Uganda quickly went downhill between President Obama and Museveni with public rhetoric. Our security cooperation, which was focused heavily on Somalia and al-Shabaab, was frozen. We could do nothing. We had been doing human rights training. The military, the UPDF, Uganda People's Defense Force, had been accepting it and adhering to it, at least in Uganda. I can't account for what they're doing in Somalia, but I could account for what they're doing in Uganda, and they were adhering to it. They were adding it to their ethos. Yet because of something the legislature passed, which many believe violated fundamental human rights, our entire security relationship was frozen, and it was a complete mess. Now, I also had an issue with that anti-homosexuality law. I thought it was wrong, but that wasn't my place. My point being is that I come down on both sides of this. Basically, at the end of the day, the most fundamental human right is the right to live unmolested and survive. And that is something that the state has a very difficult time balancing the requirements. And the other piece of this is, you're going to ask us some other questions, but Nunia's point about state action, if we get back to me, I'd like to come back to that because it's something I agree with him on. Thank you.
Great. Karen?
I found arguing the counter point very, very tough because I do very strongly believe that human rights protections advance counter-terrorism objectives based from an intellectual point of view and also a practical point of view. I think, in short, the mutually reinforcing issues of human rights and counterterrorism and getting it wrong have been borne out in this part of the world. That it's become, in the absence of a human rights approach, it's been used as a recruiting sergeant for so many armed groups to be able to undermine the very operations, the very counterterrorism operations that are being sought. I don't want to repeat too much of what has been said, but I was smiling internally at the two advocates for the proposal because they very much echoed the point that I was saying. But there's categorical research that shows that when you talk to groups like Al-Shabaab and their recruiting techniques, concerns about, say, for example, in Kenya post 2013 in the Westgate attack, the level of corruption within the security services. And given we've had reference to the propaganda of the deed, the importance of being able to win the trust of the population, that plays straight into the hands of the adversaries if you are having your own security actors representing the state violating human rights abuses themselves. Just one final point is that, I've been interested in looking at how, say, the US and Britain almost become part of the problem if they disregard human rights as part of their counterterrorism strategy. If they, for example, choose to look the other way. There's been an observation that countries fighting terrorism on behalf of the global north, and I'm using Kenya as an example because that's where I've had the most experience, but it would apply to Uganda and Burundi too, that, to provide protection against external intrusion into human rights by their own security forces domestically, there's been a kind of trade-off. It's acted as a kind of insulation that if you're fighting the global north terrorist battle, you won't have too much prying into human rights problems in your own backyard. The primacy given to counterterrorism over human rights appears to provide a reinforcement mechanism to foot dragging in places like Kenya to really affect security sector reform. It can't be a trade-off. And while I accept what my colleague Chris has just said about the fact that you can train until the cows come home, there has to be ownership of the individual state to turn that training into policy. That doesn't mean you stop trying. So I'm very much in favor of the need, as history has shown, that the securitization of fighting terrorist groups hasn't got a great history of results. I think about only 7% of terrorist groups that have existed between 1968 and 2006 ended their activities following military force, which does suggest politics and a potential human rights component to that will be more successful.
Thanks, Karen. And I want to get back to this question around that both you and Chris have raised about how we do human rights training and how governments sort of internalize that. But let me just give an opportunity for Adote and Nani Hall, if there's any points made that you want to amplify. I suspect your position was closer to your true position, certainly for Adote. But let me just open it up and see if there's anything quickly you want to amplify before we go to additional questions. Adote?
Yes, I'll just say very quickly that if the question is indeed about effectiveness, and as Karen just said, are counterterrorism efforts succeeding or not? It's impossible to evaluate if you don't actually have a free, transparent, robust investigation, and the lack of rights that these governments are affording, are imposing on civic space, in particular on civic space locally. It's one thing to ban Human Rights Watch or Amnesty, but to basically shut down local human rights groups that can actually say, well, we have spent the last month in a particular part of the country, and this is what is happening, is actually more critically important to partner governments like the United States and the UK, because that's a lot of investment that they are putting into a counterterrorism effort in partnership with these other African governments. So, notwithstanding all of the other reasons why I think all four of us have said that as messy and as often contradictory as it does come down to, you have to have human rights at a centralized or prioritized in counterterrorism efforts, literally just because You know, the Nigerian government has said it's defeated Boko Haram at least 5 times, the last time I recall. They're still attacking. So I'll stop there.
Nanihal?
So this was, again, very close to my own natural position. I came out of the human rights world before I went to graduate school. So I wasn't stretching, but I do want to admit that there are challenges here and nuances. And part of this has to do with the ability of external countries to try to enforce human rights norms. There are severe challenges with that. And there are also problems with trying to do so in such a way that we are recognizing that the norms are universal, and avoiding any appearance or feeling of imperialism or forcing of values from the global north into other countries. And so both Chris and Karen did make some points here that I thought were valuable in terms of the nuance. I suspect our true positions were actually not that far apart. There are some very tricky parts here when it comes to how things are implemented. And at the end of the day, you want the locus as you want the locus of concern of human rights, obviously, to be in that society. You want to amplify the local voices, and you want that to be the most important part of what goes on. So I think there are some challenges to how we do this, and it is much trickier to center human rights in practice, particularly when you have external partners trying to say, we are doing this and you have to do it, rather than it being a shared consensus on both sides.
Thanks, Nanihal. We're going to show the results right now to the voting, and then we'll come back with our last 10 minutes or so to answer questions around COVID-19, around socioeconomic issues, and then end with this important question that we've all touched on, is the how, and how do we do it better? So let's put up the debate results. So on the first question, human rights should be separate from counterterrorism imperatives. There was a very strong, more than 70% of the votes disagreed with that. Moving to the next question, blurring the lines between human rights and counterterrorism terrorism projects weakness to an enemy. It's much closer. 40% agreed and 60% disagreed. Third question, or third point, the US military should let Africans decide what their priorities should be. A very strong, almost 90%, 85%. Let's move to the next point. Human rights are simply a form of cultural imperialism by Western nations. Fascinating. This was a strong 90% disagree. Question point 5. Concern for human rights are essential for effective counterterrorism. 100%. Okay, good, interesting. Point 6. Human rights training is not the question. The issue is the efficacy and ownership by the partner. A strong 80% agree with that point. And our question of the debate, do human rights protections advance counterterrorism objectives? A very strong 85%. Okay, so the people have spoken, and now we're going to move to some Q&A. Given how we are all dealing with the COVID-19 response, I want to just ask a question that Daniel from the US State Department raised that I had in my list as well, which is, given the response in many countries to COVID-19 of mandatory lockdowns, forced loss of employment or income, bans on assemblies, forced tracking and testing of individuals, how should democracies respond given that these measures aren't acceptable in other contexts? Let me open that up to the panel.
Can I start us off, Jed? I think democracies have to fight back against that. And that means that we basically need to fight and protect for the rights even more urgently than ever. I think We have seen crackdowns on independent media. We've seen crackdowns on the ability for civil society groups to organize events, all of those things that you've mentioned. And that's not just in Africa. You've seen other governments, Viktor Orban in Hungary, seizing no sunset claused emergency type powers. So this is really an important moment where, even as we understand that this is an unprecedented moment, there are certain things that we cannot allow, which is basically indefinite emergency rule, restrictions on the ability to question, to critique, to ask questions, and to hold people accountable, especially given the assistance that's going to be coming in. And of course, to ensure that all aspects of the populations that are at risk, even the ones that tend to be forgotten, for example, people in prisons, people in refugee camps, IDPs, also have access to support, is going to be incredibly important now. So the principles are more valid than ever.
Thanks, Adotei. Do others want to weigh in?
I make a
Yeah,
point?
sure. I'll jump in here. Oh.
Let's go, Karen, and then Chris.
Just a quick observation. I'm talking to you from Johannesburg, and it's very interesting to look at different settings around the continent and which countries have chosen to go down the state of emergency route, like Ethiopia, and which have gone down, and Angola, which have gone down the disaster route. It sounds like semantics, but built into some of those different legal definitions are the sunset clauses, which we've just heard mentioned, and the timeliness of when do the restrictions that have been put in place, whether it's restrictions on movement or gatherings. We can't gather with more than 2 people here in South Africa without fear of arrest. How long do those last? So I think, again, we need to take quite a nuanced approach on this, because we are a continent with 55 states, and there are very, very different approaches that are being adopted legally. But I agree totally that there needs to be very, very careful monitoring because of function creep. A lot of the utility of some of the lockdown measures, I would argue, are kind of handy for fighting terrorists as well. I wouldn't argue, not as my point of view, but you can see that, for example, the Patriot Act is still in place following 9/11 in the United States. I can see in certain settings some of the harsh draconian measures without sunset clauses could find utility in other areas.
Go ahead, Chris.
All right. So, yeah, I think this is a very apropos topic. And I believe among the panelists, I think I'm probably the one with uniform service of having served in security services, at least for a long period of time. So this may sound as unusual coming from me, but it's not at all. In fact, many of my peers feel the same way, certainly in our military here in the US. But the thing is that far too often security forces view civil society and transparency as a distraction, an annoyance, something that disrupts their mission. But the reality is that the security services and governments must be accountable and transparent. And that's a real issue going on right now with the COVID-19 crisis. We see that here. Karen mentioned the Patriot Act. Absolutely. These things last forever. So in Southern Africa, we see President Masisi in Botswana, when this thing first cropped up, calling for a 6-month state of emergency without any end in sight, and talk of renewing that for another 6 months. And then we see in South Africa, we see the government, which is approaching it from a disaster standpoint. But early in the stages of this, the government of South Africa warned people that they would be prosecuted for fake news. But the problem is, when the state tells you what fake news is without really determining what fake news is, that leaves people's civil liberties and their concerns up in the air. So for instance, the Small and Medium Enterprises Department put out a questionnaire for how to receive grants for emergency help for small businesses. And the questionnaire had on there information which excluded people who weren't majority-owned businesses. And so people started sharing that in social media and reporting in the news. And the minister herself came out and claimed that that was fake news, but the information came from the government. So I think it's particularly important and very much an apropos topic to talk about this. And this is a time when civil libertarians must step to the front and must be vocal and must stand up for people's liberties and freedoms. And we cannot allow governments to simply put things in forever. This is a time more than ever when governments must be transparent and accountable to civil society. And I have grave concerns that that is not the case the globe over, including here in the United States.
Thanks, Chris. Nanihal, I want you to answer this question from Hank Cohen, former Assistant Secretary of State. He asks, are we too quick to label socioeconomic insurgents terrorism, especially if they identify with Islamic groups? And this is the part that I really want you to spend most of your remarks on, is aren't poverty and neglect more important than human rights issues for the international community to address?
Thank you. So quickly on the first, he's right to point out that there are labeling issues when it comes to terrorism. When I was starting to think about this, one of the points that came up was the fact that both the ANC and Umkhonto we Sizwe were labeled by the United States as terrorist groups until the point that Nelson Mandela joined the South African government. And so the fact that this is one of the reasons why we want to make sure that any group gets treated with respect to their human rights, because we have a whole bunch of problems with categorization. In the Sahel, there are many groups which are, in essence, criminal groups that are engaging in kidnapping, where they will label their actions terrorist actions in order to get a greater ransom. And if you treat that as if if you come in and you, with a harsh response to a criminal group's action, you end up acting against your own best interest. But to the second point here, which is a challenging one, I think it's a mistake to say that human rights are a luxury, that they can come only after we have security or only after we have development. I know the Chinese government makes that argument. It's a common argument made by communist governments. But I think it's a mistake because it ignores it ignores two things. One of them is the fact that human rights are central, actually, not only to effective governance in terms of counterterrorism, but also to effective development strategies. You can't have development strategies that are coercive on the people. You need to have development strategies that empower people, respect their rights, encourage them to flourish. And part of that is freedoms of life, liberty, communication, transportation. All of these things allow for much greater development to occur. So that's one part there. The other problem is that there is something very paternalistic that comes when we assume that people, poor people, people who are economically insecure, don't want human rights. And in fact, I think we've all had this experience when you go into local communities and you ask them, what is it you value? Part of what they will tell you very early on is that they value the rights to be free from state oppression. They value their rights to be able to express themselves freely. Perhaps they don't constitute civil rights in exactly the same way that the West does, but there's a core understanding which I would argue is universal. And a good deal of that is common across societies. And so I don't think that we should be trying to say, look, we will help you develop, or we will help you fight terrorism. And then later on, you can pick up this luxury of civil rights or human rights. I think that is a mistake. I think it is paternalistic. And I think it is not only short-sighted, but it is against our own interests. This is true with COVID. The state has certain limitations. The state can act much more effectively if it has the cooperation of people. We see this in the US. There are groups, I'm a New Yorker. In New York, there's a good deal of cooperation, but there are other places in America where people are suspicious of the central government, and it's very hard to force people to physically distance against their will. And this is true, it was true with Ebola in West Africa. It's true across the world. The more willing cooperation you have from the people, the better your health policies will be. And that's true for development policies as well.
Thanks, Nanihal. Well, with about 5 minutes left in today's event, I want to end with a topic that I've been teasing throughout our event, which is the how do we do it better? And so I'm going to ask each of our panelists to share just very quickly one or two policy recommendations so that we can do the human rights training better, perhaps, How do we think about working with governments where there's little political will to do human rights? I'll leave it to you to sort of share the issue that you want to focus on. But the point of these debates is to try to think of ways to do U.S. policy more efficiently, effectively. So, Adote, let me start with you.
Sure. I'll say that, the importance of human rights to the United States needs to be owned and communicated and amplified by all parts of the US government, both from the executive branch as well as the legislative branch. And that hasn't happened for the last 4 years. You can have wonderful training programs, you can have wonderful trainees for human rights at the actual unit level or whatever, but if there's not a clear understanding that this is important and that the United States as a whole will calculate this, include this in their calculations in their relationship, you're not going to get the necessary response by the partner governments and their security forces. And I think that the other part I would say is that the United States foreign policy on this issue has to finally commit beyond the rhetoric to actually understanding and valuing civil society in these countries and really sort of trying to model the relationships that they have with civil society here so that their partner governments also learn that civil society is not the opposition and it's not a threat to them. It's basically an essential actor that can help them in achieving the best for the countries.
Great. Chris, you have worked with African security forces. What are the ways that we do this better?
Well, first, I was about to say mic drop on Adote's comments there. He hit it spot on, I think, for a number of things. But I would modify one thing he said about the whole of government and not effectively working together. I wouldn't say the last 4 years. I would say the last 12 years would be my argument, having been inside the wire those last 12 years. But nonetheless, the thing here is this theme has come up repeatedly, and it's about governance, and it's about the role of government and how government oftentimes contributes to these problems. If we go back to the origins of Boko Haram, the people who stepped forward in Boko Haram in the beginning had legitimate grievances against the state, and they were ignored. There were limited services being delivered in the areas that they were at, they were being neglected, and they had legitimate grievances. It was only after the Nigerian government overreacted that this group reverted to terrorism. Now, it would be naive to think that that's the only circumstances. There was no reason, arguably, from a marginalization standpoint, that the Red Army faction or the Red Brigades existed, or November 17 in Greece. We had these terrorist groups in Europe that existed for ideological, political reasons. So it's not simply marginalization or discrimination or being kept from services. The origins of terrorism are complex and diverse. And so it's important to recognize that. But the real thing here is it all comes down to governance and what impact the government can have. You can't simply do a quick impact project like the UN likes to do on its peacekeeping missions and go, aha, see, we've engaged with the civil sector. No, you have to be transparent. You have to be part of the community. As a security service, you have to be out and about and do things with the public to gain their trust and vice versa. You have to be engaged. I think that's a key perspective here. And I add one more thing before I wrap up is that Karen had mentioned something about which resonated with me, 7% of terrorist groups that eventually go away as a result of military action. That's a very small figure. I think people should pay attention to that and realize that if 93% of terrorist groups go away as a result of something else, which is arguably a political solution, then gosh, maybe it's not military action that makes them go away. Conversely, arguably one can make the case that many of those terrorist groups didn't come to the table until enough pressure was applied from security. So that also is nuanced. My point is that it's a political solution and it must involve political action. Security forces are not the solution. They are a mechanism, a tool to help mitigate, hopefully not extenuate.
Okay, we have a hard stop in about a minute. So Karen and Nani Hall, your best points in 30 seconds. Karen first. Go ahead, Nani Hall, because she's muted and she can do her point after you.
Empower local voices. We need to be serious about centering human rights here, but we also need to recognize that the most important human rights voices in all of this need to be local voices.
Thank you. Karen?
we need to be much more aware about funding and funding without consequences for human rights violations. So US and other Western powers need to be aware of this, need to be aware of their own posture about dismissing human rights concerns, because it has amplified consequences. Therefore, they need to recalibrate its ties between abusive security forces and the amount of money that they get. That requires benchmarking, monitoring, evaluation, and it needs incentives, and it basically needs to lead by example and be able to highlight the leaders that do take on board the human rights component to fighting terrorism.
Great. Well, let me thank everyone for joining us today. A real thanks to Chris, Karen, Adote, and Nani Hall for their incredible remarks and being such good sports about maybe arguing against themselves at different points. I want to let everyone know that we will come back next month with our fourth debate. It will be on the very contentious lockdowns versus livelihoods debate around the COVID-19 response. And then we will end our series in July, where we will talk about great power competition. So thank you everyone for participating, and we'll see you real soon.